The tension in the studio was almost physical, hanging in the air like static before a storm. Megyn Kelly's eyes were locked on Prince Harry, with a precision honed from years of dismantling political opponents on live television. Her words were sharp, deliberate, cutting through the polite applause of the crowd. But as the opening exchange ended, something unexpected happened. Harry didn't flinch. He leaned back, calm, his gaze steady, the corners of his mouth almost lifting into a knowing smirk. In that instant, it was clear. This was not going to be the ambush she had planned. Megyn Kelly, sharp, polished, unafraid of confrontation, had built her career on putting her guests on the defensive. From high-profile politicians to Hollywood celebrities, she thrived in the crossfire of televised combat. Her style was quick, incisive, and unapologetically direct, often leaving opponents scrambling for words. Today, she brought that same edge to a special broadcast of The View, where she sat in the guest host chair. Prince Harry, once a fixture of the British monarchy, now a figure both celebrated and criticized, carried a different kind of presence. His life had been lived in front of cameras from the moment he was born, but his recent years had been marked by an intentional, public break from royal duty. His memoir, his interviews, his advocacy, all had been dissected by the media with surgical precision. Today, sitting across from Kelly, he was no stranger to scrutiny. But this moment mattered for a different reason. This wasn't about royalty or celebrity. This was about credibility, truth, and who could own the room when the lights were at their brightest. The first blow landed swiftly. Kelly leaned forward, her voice even but edged with challenge. She questioned Harry's sincerity in stepping away from the royal family, pointing out the contradiction between his calls for privacy and his recent media projects. Her phrasing was deliberate, almost surgical, framing his every public appearance as an act of hypocrisy. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the sharpness beneath the politeness. But as the opening exchange ended, something unexpected happened. Harry didn't flinch. He leaned back, calm, his gaze steady, the corners of his mouth almost lifting into a knowing smirk. In that instant, it was clear. This was not going to be the ambush she had planned. In live television, timing is everything. And Harry let the moment breathe, letting her challenge expand in the silence before he spoke. When he finally did, his tone was calm, but his words were loaded. He turned her accusation back on the media as a whole, calling out the relentless tabloid culture that had dogged him since birth. He reminded the audience that this same media had hounded his mother to her death, and that Kelly herself had built a career on adversarial interviews that sometimes crossed the line into exploitation. The air tightened. The first line of battle had been drawn. Kelly, unfazed, adjusted her posture and pressed harder. She suggested that Harry's attacks on the press were convenient, selective, that he sought publicity when it suited him and cried foul when it didn't. She brought up his Netflix deals, his speaking tours, the Oprah interview. Her voice carried the rhythm of a prosecutor, presenting evidence, each point designed to corner him. But Harry's composure was unshakable. He listened without interruption, his hands clasped loosely on the table, his expression steady. Then, when she finished, he dismantled her argument piece by piece. He spoke of the difference between telling one's own story on one's own terms and having that story twisted for profit by others. He drew on years of examples, citing instances where the palace's press office had leaked stories to protect other members of the family at his expense. The audience reacted audibly to that, a low ripple of surprise that broke the tension just enough to register. Kelly pressed on, pivoting to the suggestion that Harry's grievances were simply personal vendettas dressed up as principle. She painted him as emotionally reactive, implying that his decisions were impulsive rather than grounded in fact. But Harry's counter was measured, almost surgical. He reminded her and the audience that every allegation he had made in his book and interviews had been documented, verified, or corroborated by independent journalists. He invoked the memory of veterans he had served with, the work he'd done for wounded soldiers, the mental health initiatives he had launched. He contrasted these actions with the click-driven culture of modern newsrooms. Then came a pause, deliberate, weighted. Harry let the silence stretch until the only sound was the hum of studio equipment. The camera caught Kelly's tightening jaw. She knew he was dictating the tempo now. The conversation grew sharper. Kelly's questions became more personal, hinting at Meghan Markle's influence, suggesting that Harry's marriage had deepened his estrangement from the royal family. But Harry's replies carried a quiet authority. He refused to let the focus shift to personal relationships, steering every point back to the larger issue, accountability in the press, and the cost of letting powerful institutions operate without transparency. The room was shifting. Kelly still spoke with authority, but the weight of the moment was moving toward Harry. Then, without warning, Harry dropped the first real shock of the day. From a slim folder beside him, he drew out printed pages, screenshots of emails and text messages never before made public. He explained, calmly, that these were internal palace communications, dated and verified, showing direct coordination between senior royal staff and select members of the British press. The specifics were damning. One message outlined talking points to protect a senior royal from a brewing scandal, explicitly suggesting that negative stories about Harry and Meghan be encouraged in the tabloids to draw attention away. Another email proposed leaking details of private conversations between Harry and his father to a friendly journalist. The audience reaction was immediate. Gasps, murmurs, the rustle of shifting bodies. Kelly glanced briefly at the papers, her expression unchanged, but her voice quieter now as she questioned their authenticity. Harry's response was unflinching. These communications, he said, had been reviewed by legal counsel before he brought them. The emotional dynamic shifted instantly. Kelly was no longer in the position of controlled offense. She was on the defense, forced to navigate the minefield of new, tangible evidence. What followed was the dismantling of her entire framing. Harry spoke directly to the audience, his tone steady but charged with conviction. He described the years of calculated press manipulation, the deliberate leaking of false or distorted narratives, the way in which institutions traded in personal pain to protect their own image. He didn't raise his voice, but the intensity was undeniable. He recounted the night he learned of his mother's accident, the wall of flashbulbs that met him at every turn, the knowledge that the same machine that had hounded her was now working to undermine him and his wife. And then he looked straight into the camera, not at Kelly, not at the audience, but at the millions watching from home. He said, "You call it journalism? I call it cruelty. And now the world sees the difference." The studio felt utterly silent. Kelly's next question faltered, the crispness of her earlier tone gone. Kelly continued, detailing the human cost of media harassment, not in abstract terms, but in names, faces, moments. He spoke of veterans whose private struggles had been exploited for headlines, of families torn apart by invasive reporting, of the corrosive effect of public shaming as entertainment. Every word landed with precision, every example cut deeper. By the time he finished, Kelly was left with no opening to reclaim control. The momentum was his, entirely. When the segment ended, the air in the studio was heavy. The audience broke into applause, not the polite, obligatory kind, but the sustained, swelling kind that carried conviction. Kelly offered a professional closing, but her usual sharp edge was absent. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation began circulating online. Hashtags trended worldwide. Commentators on both sides weighed in. But the visual was undeniable. Harry, calm and composed, systematically dismantling one of television's most seasoned interrogators. Even outlets traditionally critical of him acknowledged the strength of his performance. On social media, the reaction was immediate. Supporters praised his courage and clarity, calling it his most powerful public appearance since stepping back from royal duties. Critics, who had dismissed him as self-indulgent, found themselves reckoning with the concrete evidence he had presented. The emails and texts were dissected in real time by journalists, adding fuel to the firestorm. By the end of the day, the clip had become more than just a trending moment. It was being discussed as a defining confrontation between